Please remain seated. The show will begin in 3, 2...
Like a Hellcat. For more awesome content, like and subscribe now.
In early December of 2005, I was 15 and moved to the heart of Nome, Alaska with my very large family. My name is Amadahi and I just recently turned 34. I'm an art major and part-time teacher's aide who owns her own studio apartment in Colorado. I also run a vlog where I travel the states and film interesting, sometimes unusual, creepy places. This story began with me along with my 6 brothers, 3 sisters, grandparents, uncle, and aunt. They rode in an old 1971 Dodge Tradesman, many miles to a remote cabin in the neck of the woods. My Aunt Sequoia had gone a job working in the local diner as a waitress, and my Uncle Akita was working construction. I'm the eldest of the 10 siblings, and I'm often the black sheep, usually the one who has the higher expectations within the family to help carry the heavy financial burdens. I was stuck paying for groceries, utilities, clothing, preparing meals, taking the others to school, etc. I had side jobs here and there, and I had little money for myself, as my aunt and uncle shamelessly took a chunk of it for themselves. My grandparents are the only ones that look out for me, because I'm the favored grandchild who is ambitious, has the maturity and self-discipline, that works hard every day to fulfill the needs of everyone in the family. I am considered the most selfless and generous person you'd ever have the pleasure of meeting. Anyway, a lot of my childhood circulated around old traditions of our vast native heritage, rooting from both Cherokee and Inuit. We always lived a simple life, not big on technology, just off the grid and doing everything by hand. From when I was born till I was 11 years old, I was living in Arizona before my parents had one day vanished and never came back. My aunt and uncle, the snobbish pricks they are, always claimed that my birth was nothing more than a mistake, and my parents didn't have it in themselves to love their own children. They claimed that my mother broke sacred rules and brought embarrassment to the family. My mother married outside of her own race, and biracial children just weren't accepted by the majority of my family members. When you come from a long lineage of native background that still holds grudges over centuries of land disputes and being enslaved by the whites in the times of Pocahontas, and even longer, not everyone trusts anybody on the outside. For me personally, it was stupid, and it was a miserable journey for me. A developing young woman back then that wanted to make friends with others, who even now still doesn't care about skin color. It had been some weeks, not too long after we had unpacked and got settled in. The winter air was bitter cold and merciless, the winds chilling the very marrow of our bones. We slept in just one main room with 2 king-size beds, a kitchenette, a couch, a fireplace, a couple of oak dressers, and closets made out of birch. We had an outhouse located on the far right of the property, where we had our fire pit built, and we were just surrounded by dark forest. I often snuck out late during the night to go for a stroll, despite the several warnings from my grandparents about the spirits that came out when the full moon was at its peak. I ignored them because I wasn't afraid of the unknown, and skeptically I just felt these stories they've told were just invented to scare children that misbehaved. Armed with a lantern and bundled up in a thick fur coat, dressed in a red beanie and gray gloves, I treaded along the rocky terrain, the soles of my blue boots making crunchy noises in the freshly fallen snow. The woods were awfully quiet and serene for about a half an hour, and like always I stayed on the path and I always managed to find my way back to the cabin. Well, on this particular night, all of that changed very drastically. The further I walked, the more the trees had seemingly taken on different forms, or shifted in strange positions. In the dark, sometimes your perception of your surroundings can merely play a painted illusion to feed off of imagination, to confuse you and make you go off track. That's exactly how it went down. I remember stopping abruptly to closely examine the various trees and all of their crooked branches that had extended farther out, reaching towards me. Some had carved-on faces of malice and jagged mouths. It was the fatigue that fed my paranoia that pricked away at my mind, and I was blinded by the darkness after all. The glowing ember of the lantern only gave some source of light. Not much. I came across this frozen lake when I climbed the steep hill and skidded down. The view was breathtaking. I carefully made small strides to the other side of the lake, and I sat down at my usual spot on a large flat rock. I just stared, mesmerized by the twinkle of stars in the sky and the clouds rolling by. I then caught the glimpse of a brown rabbit hopping past and burrowing a hole in the ground before it had disappeared into the dirt. Then I heard it. There was the snapping of twigs, and I was startled, flinching a bit as I jerked my head the opposite direction. My eyes averted, locked to the area where I hoped to identify the source. Dreaded silence. It's nothing, I told myself. I'm sure that it's just a deer. The air grew still, and through the blackness that shrouded over me like a veil obstructing any clear vision, I saw what looked like a huge shadow lurk past between two trees and fade away. I couldn't make out the shape, but the smell it carried was stomach-wrenching, and once it hit my nostrils, I softly gagged and held my right gloved hand to my mouth. As I turned to walk back to the cabin, infant cries emitted from the west side of the lake, where the mysterious figure appeared. It was like maybe 40 yards from where I stood, and squinting in the darkness, I noticed a trail of footprints that were long, as though someone was dragged along the frozen tundra. I was shocked. First of all, what was a baby doing all the way out here in freezing temperatures? I wondered. Had someone just abandoned it out here? I then called out to what I presumed was a person that cruelly left their baby behind, but I got no reply. The infant crying got louder and louder, and that's when I knew something was off. As I reluctantly inched towards the sound, another voice echoed from the eerie winds that picked up again. A small child, sounding like a little girl. "Help us! Help us!" voice had cried. I shivered uncomfortably, and it wasn't just the fact that I knew that there were other children out here by themselves besides me, but the sounds had a tone to them, an aura of sheer creepiness that I can't really explain. But the more I tried to ignore it and walk away, the infant cries and the voice of the little girl, they were shrill, anger-filled bellows that had a hint of deep, disembodied, out-of-this-world sort of evil. And again, the little girl started screaming, "Don't leave us here alone! Don't run away from me!" At that moment, I sprinted back the way I came, and as I slid across the ice, I stumbled and rolled into the snowbank as someone or something behind me had made these loud stomps, causing cracks within the ice. The breathing was unnatural, and the smell it carried with it made the situation even worse. It even let out venomous growls and snarled. It was like a mix of rabid dog and some caged bear, and the rage coming from whatever this thing was so powerful that I was overwhelmed by emotions. I scurried up the hill that was like a rock wall, and once I reached the top, I jumped down and raced back towards the cabin. Creatures' sounds were drawing near, and the cabin was getting farther and farther away, as though the path had continued to stretch. And it's as if by some anonymous unseen force, something was trying to make sure I wouldn't get to the front door. I was whimpering, desperately trying to pull away from this entity, and then up ahead I saw someone. It was my 79-year-old grandmother, and she frantically waved. Her eyes were widened in terror, and she then grabbed out a relic from inside of her shawl that had a soothing odor. It looked like sage, and she started speaking in native tongue, which I didn't understand well. She then instructed to me to not stop running and to not look behind me. My grandmother was walking in my direction and in circular motion waved the sage around to cleanse the air and to remove the negative energy. The creature let out these pained shrieks of frustration, and it was now starting to fall behind as I hugged my grandmother and she rushed us back to the cabin. We staggered back inside, and my grandmother began sprinkling a special kind of oil in the threshold, as well as salt before doing the doorframe, and keeping burning sage in a jar by it on the oak table by the window. My aunt and uncle were yelling swear words, demanding to know what was happening, and my grandmother just told them flatly to shut up. My sisters and brothers were exchanging bewildered glances. She then told everyone to keep quiet. We all huddled together, and my grandmother just looked side to side, listening for more sounds. We then heard the howling and the snarling and the footsteps that stomped, causing the cabin to shake as all the noises circled around. We heard something trying to claw its way in, as the clawing was coming from the far right wall across from us. And then it stopped after what was several minutes. My grandfather looked to my grandmother and asked her in a whisper,
"Could it be that it returned for one of us?"
My grandmother just looked back at him with sadness, and it's like she knew something that the rest of us didn't. Eventually the creature left, and a week later I asked my grandmother about what she saw that night, what that thing looked like. She broke down sobbing, and I held her hands in mine. To this day, she still refuses to tell me. Now, this is obviously not the only time I personally experienced the supernatural. Writing this, I'm unsure of anything I say that is really believable. Christmas was approaching, and I recall being asked to go hunting for turkey and wild hogs. My grandfather had gone with me, and we anticipated to be back before sundown. We were walking the one trail that was 3 miles long, passing by the frozen lake. My grandfather was trying to usher us along like he was distressed. I asked him what was wrong, but he just grabbed me and held on to me tight, his eyes keeping locked on the icy lake. He looked terrified. Once we gathered the food, we started walking back, and then I heard laughter. It was dark out, but I had my lantern. The laughter was my little brother Zuni, and I looked over the edge of the cliff to see him wandering on the icy lake. My grandfather went ballistic, and we hurried our way down there.
"Zuni!"
He had cried out. The old man staggered, slipping and sliding as he tried to grab my brother. He had fallen and injured his leg, fracturing his knee. I cautiously made baby steps, and I tried to be as quick as possible to reach my 5-year-old brother. He and I were halfway across the lake, and up ahead, in the center of the lake, there was this big hole, and I could see a scaly green webbed claw tapping on the surface of the ice. My little brother Zuni eagerly followed the tapping, and I could hear humming coming from the hole in the ice. That's when I saw its head stick out. My grandfather stammered out the word.
"Krolubik."
He then reached into his bag and tossed me something wrapped up in brown paper. I caught it and unraveled the paper, which revealed a king crab. Before the fish monster could grab my brother's arm, I threw the crab at it and managed to snatch Zuni. The creature let out this squeal, and I carried my little brother. Him, my grandfather, and I took our time getting back to the cabin. Everyone but my aunt and uncle had cared at all that we were scared to death. My grandmother shot a glare at them and said that they shouldn't have left my little brother unsupervised. She also blamed them for angering the forest spirits in the first place by disrespecting the land, which unleashed the wrath of very dangerous entities upon the family. I tried getting answers from her, but to no avail. She still refused. Then I remember my aunt made some disrespectful comments. She was clearly drunk, and the things she said I won't repeat, because it was that bad. The kind of language no child of any age should hear. She said something that was equally as disturbing. Said how my mother saw it coming when she had gotten in the way. My grandmother bitch slapped her so hard that I thought I could see my aunt's eyes spin around like something out of a cartoon. Then about supper time, we all sat at the dining table and ate in awkward silence. In the middle of the night, I heard the front door open and shut. The next morning, we all discovered my aunt and uncle were missing. We figured that they got up early and took the van to go get groceries. but the van was still out in the driveway. We went looking for them all day long and had no luck. We called the police, and the authorities searched the entire perimeter, even had their bloodhounds scour the woods for hours on end. Still nothing. A report was filed, and we heard nothing more. We carried on with life like normal. My grandparents had to pick up jobs to support the family. They got jobs at the local diner in town, and oftentimes I stayed home to look after my siblings. My grandparents were usually gone until 7 p.m. I kept to the usual chores, and one of my brothers, Achak, asked me if he and the others could go frog hunting. I scolded him gently, saying that our grandparents forbade us from leaving the property. After the previous incidences, the woods were no longer a safe place. Achak, however, didn't buy the stories of me getting chased by some big monster in the forest, or how Zuni was nearly dragged away by a fish thing at the lake. By the time 3 o'clock hit, I was doing my stacks of bookwork, and my other siblings were taking a nap. I at some point fell asleep, and I was later startled by the frantic yelling of my younger sisters, Awena and Halona, who came to me and said that Achak was gone. I told them to use the landline that we had installed and to call our grandparents. I couldn't bring myself to leave my siblings alone. Within the hour, my grandparents came back, and I remained at the cabin with my siblings while they looked for Achak. 3 hours went by, and they were a sobbing mess. Police were called again and were patrolling the woods. They came back and brought back only my brother's boots that were stained in blood. I volunteered to go looking for him myself, but my grandparents said I couldn't. I was angry. Why wouldn't they tell me anything? At this point, I didn't care about what would happen to me. I just wanted my brother to be safe, and I wanted to bring him home. So right when everyone else went to bed, I snuck out again and made my way back into those woods. I regret it looking back, but if you were in my position, would you have just sat around and done nothing? Would you just hope and pray to God that by some miracle that your sibling would turn back up to your doorstep unharmed? That this was all just a stunt, some cruel prank to pull on your family, to laugh at their expense?